Gregor Larson is back. You're a pretty busy guy over there at Oxford University. You seem to me like the hunter-gatherer of many great scientists around the world. And somehow you gather them all into bushel baskets and then find out these incredible things about dogs and wolves and humans and how we all interacted originally. Is that how do you look at yourself that way?
I don't know. I like to see myself as a small cog in a very large connected machine of great people, and I'm just lucky to work alongside them.
You work alongside them, but you also have this fancy title, Director of the Paleogenomics and Bio-Archaeology Research Network in the School of Archaeology, Oxford University. That's a mouthful. But
Yeah,
you
sort
are
of.
the gatherer, right? You gather in this stuff.
One reason that title is so long is because it's called a backronym. The shape of our building looks like a barn, and we work on a lot of different animals. And so we thought, is there a way that we can get to the acronym barn? What words can we come up with that would then make barn? So it was, yeah, that,
That's
that,
very funny. That's the way a scientist's mind works, apparently. One of the things that really jumped out at me, the New York Times is always quoting you. Is it because you were originally American and now you're British and live there and you're high on the feeding chain of British academia?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just that we started working on dogs from a genetic perspective, probably about 15 years ago, and we had some early successes. And I think that's just by virtue of the fact that they knew us then that they reach out to us frequently now. So we're still doing stuff, but they know who we are, and so they like to ask us questions.
You're in their toolbox of go-to people.
There you go. Yeah, yeah.
Interesting dog, wolf, human information comes along. What fascinates me is that, as you said, for 15 years you've been studying dogs, and ancient dogs at some point were wolves, and ancient people at some point looked a lot different and lived a lot differently than us. But wolves have now come into, at least in America, a kind of consciousness. I think I mentioned to you in an email, Thomas Wharton has a book coming out, a novel called Wolf, Moon, Dog, from the perspective of an ancient wolf, probably, and he's a historian and he's Canadian in a sense, but a wolf throughout human history, the different ways that wolf slash dog would have interacted. Then I've had somebody with a wolf sanctuary on the show. Then I have, I don't know, another wolf person I should remember. Oh, yeah, Oliver Starr, The Wolf Lover's Guide to Raising Dogs. He and his wife live in a wolf habitat. They've
Wow.
raised the wolves and they live with them. And they have some dog-like qualities, but basically they would take his arm off if he took their bone away. Do you think that your time has finally come and wolves and dogs and their interaction is catching people's imagination?
What I think what we've been lucky at is that we happen to have been working on an interesting question just as the advances in the technology have allowed for some additional insights.
Yeah.
And that's been a lot more by accident than design. No one could have anticipated just how much overall sequencing data that we could be generating now from when I started. So the story that I like to tell is that during my PhD, for 4 years between 2002 and 2006, I was working primarily on pigs, and I was really putting a huge amount of effort into getting exactly 80 base pairs from ancient pigs, 80. So that wasn't a whole lot. In fact, I had that whole sequence pretty much memorized. I knew exactly what it started with. I knew exactly where the mutations were along that strand that would tell me about different populations. But my whole world was 80 base pairs. And I would visualize them. I could see them on the screen. And now we routinely generate, and this is no exaggeration, 80 billion base pairs. And so it has gone up by so many orders of magnitude that we don't even, the whole way we think about, the whole way we deal with, the whole way we store and analyze that volume of data is now radically different from my paltry little 80 base pair fragment that I still absolutely love from 15
Oh,
years ago.
that's so cool. For the rest of us who are not scientists, so oh, okay, DNA, kind of know what that means. Genomics, kind of know what that means. Talk about base pairs. Talk about why the sequencing of DNA of ancient materials, whether they're bones or teeth or fur or whatever you can gather. What is it? Can you explain it to us in layman's terms? Like if
Yeah,
you have a
sure.
really young
So
child.
the classic analogy that everybody uses is just that your genome is the blueprint for your life. And
Okay.
or for you as an individual, and you have your own personal genome. And just about every one of the multi-billion cells that make you will have a single copy of your entire genome, which is think of it as a book that is 3.5 billion letters long, that is made up only of A's or C's or T's or G's in a particular sequence of those letters that starts at position 1 on chromosome 1 and ends at the final position of chromosome 23. And that whole book is 3.5 billion base pairs long.
which sounds like a lot to me.
It is a
You
lot. And what's really nice about that is that affords a tremendous amount of resolution, as you could imagine, because you and I are going to vary at quite a few different places along that 3.5 billion
yeah.
base pair stretch. And so we can then, if we can retrieve all of those base pairs going back deep in time from a whole range of organisms, because that's the other brilliant thing about DNA, is
Right.
that all life on Earth is made up of their own sequence of those same 4 letters. So it's only 4 letters, and it's just the
Wow.
sequence of those 4 letters. And there are some organisms that have only a few thousand base pairs in their genomes, and there are other organisms that have tens of billions of base pairs. And there really is no rhyme or reason in terms of complexity or
Oh,
age or any
really?
number of other things. Oh yeah, and in fact, even between people, it's a simplification to say that people have about 3.5 billion base pairs. You and I will differ also at precisely how many base pairs we have, because there are whole deletions and whole insertions that take place, and so there's structural variants that mean that we have about 3.5 billion, but nobody's exactly the same as anybody else.
So these 80 pairs you had for the pigs you were,
The 80 base pairs, yeah.
80 base pairs that you were studying, these, it wasn't 80 pigs, it was 80 base pairs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
How many pigs?
Oh, a couple hundred from an ancient perspective. But the thing about ancient DNA is that what DNA does is, as soon as an organism is dead, the DNA starts to degrade very quickly.
Oh,
So it's like the rest of you, right? Your skin and your
right.
bones and everything
Yeah.
will melt away and become and get eaten by everything else around you. And you just
Yeah.
degrade. So your DNA is no different, and it too degrades. And so that means that when we go back in and we get stuff, even things that it's like almost immediately, as soon as something is dead, there's all kinds of enzymes that come in and start cleaving the DNA, which means it's then much more difficult to get access to and much more difficult to get any sort of long reads. So what we have to get better at, and what we have gotten better at, is retrieving those tiny little fragments that are left and then stitching them all back together again,
Oh my.
and then trying to come up with a complete book again when we're just dealing with, there's 3.5 billion base pairs we want to stitch together for humans, but if you can only do that in little fragments of 50 base pairs here, or 20 base pairs there, or 150 base pairs there, oh geez, it becomes a much more difficult thing to piece it all back together.
A puzzle, one of those puzzles
It's a
where
huge puzzle. Yeah.
most of it is like earth and water and sky, and you're supposed, so it all is very hard to find where they fit together. So this is what happens when you find the jawbone of an ancient dog.
So, but the great thing is that because the sequencing technology now means that for a long time there was this big race. So it cost millions, tens of millions of dollars to generate the very first human genome. You can now routinely sequence a human genome for about 100 or so. It's super cheap and super fast, and which means that everything on Earth is currently being sequenced. Just with the total data generation is just absolutely insane. It's like the number of videos on YouTube, right? It just keeps
Okay.
skyrocketing, right?
Right, right.
It's
A lot of
absolutely phenomenal. So what that gives us is a huge amount of variability from modern genomes that we can then use to say, okay, can we distinguish, say, wolves and dogs using a modern genome, which then allows us to go back to some of the ancient material, jawbones or occasionally hair or bits of other bones or teeth. And if we even just get a small amount of that DNA, because we have so much modern reference material, we can then say, this is far more likely that this tooth now belongs to a dog lineage or a wolf lineage. So we don't even have to generate the entirety of the genome because we have access to so many modern reference genomes, that we can then say, okay, even if we can only get, in this case, we did get over 1 billion base pairs from the one from Goff's case, from that mandible that you were talking about. So that made it far easier, because the more DNA you have, the greater resolution you have, the easier it is to distinguish between different things. And in this case, there was this jawbone that there was some speculation on the part of some of the people who looked at this after it was excavated, who thought this could well be a dog, but there was no real way to determine it, because if you look at size or you look at shape, it's difficult to distinguish. But the DNA affords you with such a hyper degree of resolution that we didn't even need that much. And then when the team when we got the DNA out of the bone, we then throw it and compare it against all the other known dogs and wolves. And they're like, oh, look at that. It is so much more similar to all of the modern and ancient dogs than it is to wolves, that this is very clearly a dog.
Wow. So when you say we got all that material, were you depending on your colleagues who are out with a pick and a sifter or whatever it is that an archaeologist works
Sifter.
with?
In short, yes. What we do in our lab, we don't do any excavation, although I am based in an archaeology department. And there are many colleagues of mine who routinely go out and do digs and win large grants to go conduct
Wow.
large scale excavations on all six of the seven continents at least. But a lot of that material that gets excavated then goes into museums or goes into stores or goes into what are called archaeological units. And those are the places where all those boxes of material will get stored so that we don't have to rely on new excavations necessarily. We often will go to museums or speak to people, collections managers, and get access to material through those means that have been, in some cases, in the case of Goff's Cave, it was dug in the 19th century. So these are things that were excavated a long time ago. And then we are able to get access to it and try and do what we can to get the DNA from it.
And that was a British cave.
Yes. So Goff's Cave is in what's called the Mendip Hills in western UK in Western England.
Okay.
If anybody's ever been to Glastonbury, the big musical festival,
Right?
it's you if you stand on the top of the cave where this dog was found, you can get a free view of Glastonbury from you're not super close, you're not going to see anybody up close, but you will see the spectacle taking place down on the plain.
And the people that are allowed in that cave are highly regulated by who?
You know what? Interestingly, it's got its own amazing history of when people first started digging it because it's in this really interesting valley and these limestone caves. So Goffs is just one of several caves all the way along this whole system. And people were finding bones in there in the 19th century, and that became a sort of fad. And so the people would then
Oh,
go in. And
wow.
so for a very long time, it was the tourist go-to destination through the middle and late 19th century, and then again all the way into the 20th century. And now, even more recently, it's a big tourist destination.
And anybody can go in there and look for a
Oh yeah,
bone.
yeah. I think it's 5, 10 quid, something like that. It's relatively inexpensive, and you can just go in and it's all lit very nicely, and they've excavated some chambers, and there's lots of
Really?
signage, and it's really, yeah, it's
So
great.
it's
It's
a
an
little
amazing place
different
to
than,
be.
let's say, the Lascaux caves or the caves in France
Oh,
that have drawings on them and only so many people allowed in a day, and they worry about our respirations and the humidity. The British, what, are not that
well,
protective of their dog bones, or
it's not that. It's just that all of the material that you could excavate from it has been excavated, and now it's down to just the bedrock.
oh, I
So, and there aren't any paintings in it. And so
right.
but you do get some pretty spectacular stalagmites and some stalactites and some other water features and things. Plus, the other thing is that it was found so early and then excavated relatively early and completely excavated. And then in order to change the flow of the people, they use some dynamite in some places to blow up bits of it. So it's had a pretty interesting
A
kind
lot
of.
of human manipulation.
Yes, a lot of let's make this a tourist destination and less of let's preserve this forever. And there's nothing left to excavate now because all of the sediment has been
They got
excavated.
they got all the bits and pieces out that could be of
Yeah,
any value
yeah.
for historical purposes.
And because it was excavated so early, it probably wasn't excavated in this to the same degree of precision or of careful excavation that it had been. So there were a lot of things that just disappeared. And so for a lot, we're actually pretty lucky that a lot of the bone material still survives. There are humans have been found in this cave as well, and the humans bear some marks that appear that they were practicing a kind of maybe a post-mortem cannibalism. So there was some ritual practice.
Ah,
So that's why it was so famous for such a long time, is that there were humans clearly in the cave that had been researched, but of course, because we're fascinated with ourselves and maybe less so with the rest of us, these dog bones had been more or less left to one side, also because it wasn't clear that they were dogs. But there's been a little bit of work on some of the animals, but for the most part, all it's if you've got humans eating each other, that's going to lead, right?
yeah, yes, that's going to be the headline. So, what is it that in this fairly recent new paper, what is it that has been discovered about this divergence from wolves to dogs? Is it that it happened sooner, or it's some new finding?
Yeah, and we were thrilled with this because the archaeologists have been saying for a very long time, predicated upon a lot of different lines of evidence, but they had saying it even as a hunch is underselling it. A lot of them were very confident, and with good reason, that there were dogs in Europe at, say, 14 or 15,000 years ago. Genetically, however, the earliest dog that we were able to find was from around St. Petersburg in Russia, and that was just shy of about 11,000 years. So there was this gap between what the genetics was saying, we can corroborate dogs going back to 11,000, and a lot of the archaeologists going, yeah, you might not have genetics, but we're pretty confident that there are some dogs here a few thousand years before that at least. And so what was great about this paper was that we have, and for actually both papers that appeared in the same issue, was that there were three separate dogs, one from Goff's Cave in the UK that was dated to about 14,500, one about 14,500, 15,000 from Switzerland, and then a far earlier one at about 16,000 that was found on a place called the Konya Plain in Turkey at a site called Pınar. And all three of those dogs, or all three of those remains, were then had enough DNA preservation that we were able to get access to it and sequence it. And then the two different papers were able to show that, in fact, all three of those remains belonged very much to the dog lineage and not to the wolf lineage, thereby pushing the earliest genetically confirmed dogs back another 5,000 years, from 11,000 to 16,000.
That's pretty cool.
And not just that, and because this is what really thrilled me about the whole thing, was that we were then able, as a very good friend and colleague of mine who I work with referred to, is because we had these genomes of these dogs, we were able to then to look at a number of other dogs from which we didn't have the nuclear genome, but we did have some other genetic markers. And he said that these dogs then became the Rosetta Stone, which then allowed us to say, actually, we now have about 5 or 6 other dogs from places like Italy, I think there's one from France, and a few other places in Europe that we have one signature, but because it matches this other signature of known dogs, then those must be dogs as well, including this dog called from the site of Bonn Oberkassel in Germany, which was a burial, which was a juvenile, which appeared to have some disease and looked after. And so for a long time, there was all kinds of other evidence that suggested this is an animal which is sharing a very close relationship with people. So we suspected it's a dog. And now we have these series of lines of evidence which all connect to each other that say, yes, this one is a dog as well, which means two things that are very cool for me. One is that far from being unique or rare, it looks as though by 15,000 years ago, dogs were just everywhere, at least across Western Europe. And they all immediately just explode out of the landscape. Whereas before they're invisible, we're looking for them. And the next thing you know, we have this new technique and we start linking them all together. And then boom, we've got dogs in the UK, we've got dogs in Germany and in France and Spain and Italy and Turkey. And it's just, okay, now at 15,000 years, there's dogs everywhere. And then on top of that, because we have sufficient evidence from the genomes, from the whole nuclear genomes of these dogs, we can then say how closely related are these dogs. And it looks like they are very closely related, much more so than you would expect given how far apart they are. Because of course, the further apart any two populations are, the more distantly genetically related they are. That tends to be. And especially in a time when people were not moving super fast as we are right now with like transatlantic travel and everything else. Right. So given the distance between them, they have no business being as closely related as they are, which to me, and this is where I'm maybe speculating a bit, it seems like this is really the first population of dogs that are getting into Western Europe. Because if they're all super closely related, then that means that they only had their origin relatively recently before that. And then they all come sweeping through and everybody's got to have one of these things. And what's so fun about it is that and this is where I like the idea of a Swiss Army knife, which is that there are people in Turkey and people in the UK, and they are over 2,000 miles apart. They're occupying completely different landscapes with totally different plants and animals, totally different stone tools that they've got, totally different weapons and ways of hunting and ways of interacting. Everything about them is radically different, and yet their dogs are virtually the same. And so what it seems like is that this is a kind of an innovation or a new technology where they're talking to each other and they're moving around, and there's a fair bit of movement and interaction between these different groups of people. But as soon as the dogs start coming in, everybody's, you know what, you guys, you got to have one of these things. They're just amazing. And they start passing, and the idea is that they're passing them along. So what we're not then seeing is people necessarily moving with these dogs in tandem, but the same dog or the same kind of group of dogs that are all very closely related are certainly getting moved by people across all of Western Europe, going from Turkey all the way to the UK.
And that means the people are having dialogue, having trade, having interaction with each other way before, I don't know, the Silk Route or something.
Oh yeah, we're 15,000 years it's far before that's. So Rome is, say, 2,000 years ago is when Rome was really getting started. So we're 13,000 years before that. And so crazy. Agriculture is 10,000-ish. So it's even 5,000 years prior to anybody having anything to do with being tied to a landscape where they're having to farm and plant and live off of crops that they're growing purposely.
This is a nomadic lifestyle.
Yes, they're certainly not reliant on any kind of what we would now consider to be like an agricultural practice. So they're hunter-gatherers in that regard. The degree of nomadism is an interesting question because by this point, if you are, there are populations of people who happen to be living in very in areas where there's a whole lot of kind of, for lack of a better phrase, kind of protein on the landscape. And that tends to be,
Okay.
Vancouver is a place, southern Scandinavia, southeastern Australia, where there are people who aren't, they've got relatively large communities. They're not moving around a lot because they can subsist all year round on a very stable resource
Wow.
base. So, but there are other places where people are moving pretty long distances or seasonally or altitudinally moving around to try, because if something gets snowed over in the winter, you gotta move, following a kind of a bird migration idea. So lots of different people across the planet are pursuing very different ways of subsisting. But in this particular case, at about 15,000, which by the way is not that long after what we call the last glacial maximum. So at about 18 to 20,000 years ago, sea levels were 120 meters lower because all of that water was locked up in ice. And there were 2 kilometer glaciers all over northern Europe, all over northern US. And so that reaches its peak at about, say, 20,000 years ago. And then it starts melting. And the first couple thousand years, it's not melting very quickly, but and they're providing new opportunities for people to move into more northern areas where they had been before this, but then got kicked out because the ice came down and covered everything. So right at this point, where we've gone through the last glacial maximum, things are just starting to warm up, is that's when we're finding these same dogs everywhere. And it's very tempting to think that maybe it was during the last glacial maximum with at least in the northern hemisphere, things got really sketchy. We see lots of population decline of a huge range of different mammals. Humans leave the UK and everything gets just, ugh, it's
Really?
hard to live. And
Wow.
so maybe that's what's forcing wolves and people together, maybe, right? There's this kind of,
Also forcing people together.
yeah,
Otherwise, how
exactly.
do they trade or give or share these dogs?
So by 15,000, you definitely have a disparate group of people in the UK and Turkey. But it's the few thousand years prior to that where everybody's getting hit pretty hard. And maybe that's providing this kind of lighting the blue touch paper, forcing the wolves that were around at the time and the people together to try and they form a partnership that then ends up lasting much longer.
It's
Because what's
about
interesting is that
survival.
so yeah, exactly. And whether it was however intentional or unintentional or lucky or accident, it's hard to say. But what is interesting is that we've sampled now, not just us, but a whole bunch of different groups over the last, say, 10 years or so. I'm gonna say 40 to 50 different bones that people thought might be dogs that predate this 16,000 years. So we start 17, 18, 19, 20, all the way up to 30,000 years ago. And every single time it's come back as a wolf. And so what we're not, it's just
Fascinating.
really interesting to me. Now, the numbers aren't huge, and there's still a lot more work to be done on this. But what's intriguing to me is that we are setting up this situation where globally, the earliest dogs that we're able to find genetically are about 16,000 years. And then we get lots of them after that. But before that, in China, we're seeing them at 12,000. In Scandinavia, we're seeing them a little bit later than that. But they're moving around. Oh, in the US, we start to see them at about 10 or 11,000. So there is definitely, once dogs start, they start moving around very quickly. But it's intriguing to me that we don't see anything before 16.
And yet before that, you see wolves. So,
Tons of wolves, and you
so,
see an
so
amazing variety of wolves going back. There are wolves that we have sequences from that are over 100,000 years old, and they
oh
are
my
all
God.
and there's wolves in Eurasia at least by 300,000, and those wolves have this phenomenal variability, which just the modern wolf population in both North America and in Eurasia is great, but it's been really hit pretty hard over the last few thousand years because you have dogs and wolves are a problem and people have been extirpating them at a very rapid rate. So it's amazing that there are any wolves around. But the ones that are around have just this tiny little bit of variability that was just this small fraction of what was actually on the planet at 100,000 years ago.
Amazing. And obviously, dogs are not going to be phased out in the same way because humans are keeping them going strong with variety, whatever the health issues may be. The dogs are not in danger of being exterminated.
Precisely because they are so closely linked to people. For
Yeah.
me, there's a formula which is wolf plus human equals dog, right?
Yep.
It's dogs are then the end result of a natural interaction between a wolf population and a human population. But that process makes dogs significantly different from wolves behaviorally, phenotypically, size, color, shape, all those different things. But that makes them very good with people, but not so good if they were have to go back and live the lifestyle of a
Survive
wolf.
on their own.
Yeah.
Well, it's an amazing, just as a last comment, the fact that all of you scientists from so many different countries are all sharing this information and coming up with solutions and equations together. Reminds me of how you all, the ancient ones all shared the dogs, and now you're sharing the information. It's great,
That's
Gregor.
a nice analogy. No, and I completely agree. And really, science at its best is international because
Yes,
there's only so many people who get really fascinated by this and are willing to sacrifice a large salary, perhaps doing something
right.
better elsewhere. But we have the freedom and really the luck to be able to pursue our curiosity. And sometimes when it leads to things like this, you just feel, oh, it makes it all worthwhile because everybody gets to share in the big
Yes,
adventure.
including us. We all are so happy you're doing it, all of we dog lovers and wolf lovers. So thank you
Exactly.
for doing the work and for sharing it with us. Really
Thank you, Tracy.
wonderful. Take care, Gregor.